Clever Woman of the Family, Chapter 1, In Search of a Mission. It is very kind in the dear mother. But what, Rachel, don't you like it? She so enjoyed choosing it for you. Oh, yes, it is a perfect thing in its way. Don't say a word to her. But if you are consulted for my next birthday present, Grace, couldn't you suggest that one does cease to be a girl? Only try it on, Rachel, dear. She will be pleased to see you in it. Oh, yes, I will demise myself to oblige her. I do assure you I am not ungrateful. It is beautiful in itself, and shows how well-natured can be imitated. But it is meant for a mere girl, and this is the very day I had fixed for halting down the flag of youth. Oh, Rachel. Aha! If Rachel be an old maid, what is Grace? Come, my dear, resign yourself. There is nothing more unbecoming than a want of perception of the close of young ladyhood. Of course, I know we are not quite young girls now, said Grace, half perplexed, half annoyed. Exactly. From this moment we are established as the maiden sisters of Avonmouth, husband and wife to one another, as a maiden pair always are. Then thus let me crown our bridal, quoth Grace, placing on her sister's head the wreath of white roses. Treacherous child, cried Rachel, putting her hands and tossing her head. But her sister held her still. You know, brides are always take liberties. Please, dear, let it stay till the mother has been in, and pray don't talk before her of being so very old. No, I will not be a shock to her. We will silently assume our immunities, and she will acquiesce if they come upon her gradually. Grace looked somewhat alarmed, being perhaps in some dread of immunities and aware that Rachel's silence would, in anyone else, have been talkativeness. Ah, mother dear, good morning. As a pleasant, placid-looking lady entered, dressed in black, with an air of feeble heart, but of comely middle age. Birthday greetings, congratulations, and thanks followed, and the mother looked critically at the position of the wreath, and Rachel, for the first time, turned to the glass and met a set of features of an irregular, characteristic cast. Brow low and broad, nose retrousse, with large, singularly sensitive nostrils quivering like those of a high-bred horse at any emotion, full pouting lips, round cheeks glowing with the freshest red, eyes wide open, deep, dark, gray, and decidedly poignant, though curtains with thick black lashes. The glossy chestnut hair partook of the redundance and vigor of the whole being, and roses hung on it gracefully, though not in conjuring with the thick winter dress of blue and black tartan, still looped up over the dark petticoat and hose, and stout high-heeled boots that, like the gray cloak and felt hat, bore witness to the early talk. Grace's countenance and figure were in the same style, though without so much of a mark or animation, and her dress was of like description, but less severely plain. Yes, my dear, it looks very well. And now you will oblige me not to wear the black lace thing that looks fit for your grandmother. Poor lovely Kenlin's aunt made it, mother, and it was very expensive and wouldn't sell. No wonder, I am sure, and it was very kind in you to take it off their hands, and now it is paid for. It can't make much difference whether you disfigure yourself with it or not. Oh yes, dear mother, I will bind my hair when you bid me do it. And really, these buds do credit to their makers. I wonder whether they cost them as dear in health as lace does, she added, taking off the flowers and examining them with a grave, sad look. I choose white roses, proceeded the well-pleased mother, because I thought they would suit either the silks you have now, though I own I should like to see you in another white muslin. I have done with the white muslin, said Rachel, rousing from her reverie. It is an affection of a girlish simplicity, not becoming of our age. Oh, Rachel, thought Grace in despair, and to her great relief in that moment filed in the 5 maids, the coachman, and the butler, and the mother began to read prayers. Breakfast over, Rachel gathered up her various gifts and betook herself to a room on the ground floor with the appliances of an ancient schoolroom. Rather dreamily, she took out a number of copybooks and began to write copies in them in large hand text. And this is all I am doing with the fellow creature, she muttered half aloud. One class of half-grown lads, and those grudged to me. Here is the world around one mass of misery and evil. Not a paper do I take up, but I see something about the wretchedness and crime, and here I sit with health, strength, and knowledge, and able to do nothing, at the risk of breaking my mother's heart. I have pottered about cottages and taught at schools in the way of the young ladies who think it her duty to be charitable, and I am told that it is my duty. And I may be satisfied when I see children cramped in soul, destroyed in body, that fine ladies may wear lace trimmings, satisfied with the blight of the most promising buds, satisfied when I know that every alley and lane of town or country reeks with vice and corruption, and that there is one cry for workers with brains and with purses. And here I am, able and willing, only longing to task myself to the utmost, yet tethered down to the merest acquaintance. I must be a mere helpless, useless being, growing old in a ridiculous fiction of prolonged childhood, affecting those graces of so-called sweet 17 that I never had. Because why? Because why? It is for any reason, then, because no mother can bear to believe her daughter no longer on the list of matrimony. Oh, dear mother does not tell herself that this is the reason, but she is unconsciously acuted by it, and I have hitherto given way to her wish. I mean to give way still in a measure, but I am 25, and I will no longer be withheld from some path of usefulness. I will judge for myself, and with my mission has declared itself, I will not be withheld from it by any scruple that does not approve itself to my reason and consciousness. If it be only a domestic mission, say the care of Fanny, poor dear helpless Fanny, I would that I knew she was safe. I would not despise it. I would throw myself into it and regard the training her and forming her boys as a most sacred office. It would not be too homely for me, but I had rather come the founder of some establishment that might relieve women from the oppressed taskwork thrown on them in all their branches of labor. Oh, what a worthy ambition. Rachel, called Grace, come here. There's a letter from Fanny herself. Make haste. Mama is so nervous till you read it. No exhortation was needed to make Rachel hurry to the drawing room and tear back the black edge letter with the Australian stamp. All is right, Mamma. She has been very ill, but is fast recovering, and was to sail by the Valtelia. Why, she may be here any day. Any day? My dear Grace, see that the nurseries are all well aired. No, Mother, she says her party is too large and wants us to take the furnished house for her to come into at once. Myrtle Wood, if possible. Is it let, Grace? I think I saw a notice in the window yesterday. Then I'll go and see about it at once. But, my dear, you don't really mean that poor dear Fanny thinks of coming anywhere but to us, said her mother anxiously. It is very considerate of her, said Grace. With so many little children, you would find them too much for you, dear mother. It is just like Fanny to have thought of it. How many are there, Rachel? Oh, I can't tell. They got past my reckoning long ago. I only know that they are all boys and that this baby is a girl. Baby? Aw, poor Fanny. I feared that there was a reason they did not come sooner. Yes, she has been very ill. She always is, I believe. But there is very little about it. Fanny could write letters. She only just said, I have not been able to attempt a letter sooner. And though my dear little girl is 5 weeks old to the day, think of the daughter coming at last, too late for her dear father, who had so wished for one. She is very healthy, and I am thankful to say. And I am now so much better that the doctor says I may sail next week. Major Keith has taken our cabins in Volterra, and soon after you receive this, I hope to be showing you my dear boys. They are such good, affectionate fellows, but I am afraid that they would be too much for my dear aunt. And our party is so large, so the Major and I both think it will be the best way for you to take a house for me for 6 months. I should like Myrtle Wood best, if it is to be had. I have told Conrad all about it, and how pretty it is, and it is so near you that I think I can be happy as ever I can be again in this world, and have you advice for the dear children. Poor darling, she seems but a child herself. My age, 25, returned Rachel. Well, I should go and ask about the house. Remember, Mother, this influx is to bring no trouble or care to you. Fanny Temple is my charge from henceforth. My mission has come to seek me, she added, as she quitted the room in eager excitement of affection, emotion, and importance, for Fanny had been more like a sister than a cousin. Grace and Rachel Curtis were the daughters of the squire of the homestead, Fanny, of his brother, an officer in the army. Left at home for the education, the little girl had spent her life from her 7th to her 16th year as absolutely one with her cousins, until she had been summoned to meet her father at the Cape, under the escort of an old friend, General Sir Stephen Temple. She found Colonel Curtis sinking under fatal disease, and while his relations were preparing to receive, almost to maintain, his widow and daughter, they were electrified by the tidings that gentle little Fanny, at 16, had become the welcome wife of Sir Stephen Temple at 60. From the time little had been known about her, her mother had continued with her, and the two Mrs. Curtises had never been cordial or intimate, and Fanny had never been a full or willing correspondent, feeling perhaps the difficulty of writing under changed circumstances. Her husband had been in the various commands in the colony, without returning to England, and all that was known of her was a general impression that she had much ill health and numerous children, and was tended like an infant by her bustling mother and doting husband. More than half a year back, tidings had come of the almost sudden death of her mother, and about 3 months subsequently, one of the officers of Sir Stephen's staff had written to announce that the good old general had been killed by a fall from his horse while on the on the round of inspection at a distance from home. The widow was then completely prostrated by the shock and promised to write as soon as she was able, and this was a fulfillment of that promise, bringing the assurance that Fanny was coming back with her little ones to the home of her childhood. Of that, Grace and Rachel were the joint heiresses, though it was owned by their mother for her life. It was an estate and farm moorland, worth some 3,000 or 4,000 a year, and the house was perched on a beautiful promontory running out into the sea and enclosing one side of a bay, with a small fishing village had recently expanded into a quiet watering place, esteemed by some for its remoteness from railways and for the calm and simplicity that the yearly diminished by its increasing population. It was the family fashion to look down from their crag at the new esplanade with pity and contempt for the ruined loneliness of the pebbly beach. And as Mrs. Curtis had not health to go often into society, she had been more careful where she trusted her daughters. They belonged to the county by birth and tradition, and were not to be mixed up with the fleeting residents of the watering place, on whom they never called, unless by specific recommendation from a mutual friend, and a few permanent inhabitants chanced to be such, that a visit to them was in some degree a condensation. Perhaps there was more of a timidity and caution than a pride in their mother's exclusiveness, and Grace had always acquiesced in it as the natural and established state of affairs, without any sense of superiority, but rather of being protected. She had a few alarms as the result of Rachel's new immunities of age, and though never questioning the wisdom of her clever sister's conclusions, dreaded the effect on the mother, whom she had been forbidden to call Mamma. At their age, it was affecting an interesting childishness. Rachel had had the palm of cleverness conceded to her ever since she could recollect, when she had read better at 3 years old than her sister at 5, and ever after, though the days of education had enjoyed and excelled in the studies that were the toil to Grace. Subsequently, while Grace had contented herself with the ordinary course of unambitious feminine life, Rachel had thrown herself into the process of self-education with all her natural energy, and carried on her favorite studies by every means within her reach, until she considerably surpassed in acquirements and reflections all the persons with whom she came into frequent contact. It was a homely neighborhood, a society well-born and of circumscribed interest and habit, and little connected with the great progressive world, where, however, Rachel's sympathies all lie, necessarily fed, however, by periodical literature instead of by conversation or commerce with living minds. She began by being stranded on the ignorance of those who surrounded her, and found herself isolated as a sort of pendant, and as time went on, the narrowness of interests chafed her, and in like manner left her alone. As she grew past girlhood, the com bono question had come to interfere with her ardor in study for its own sake, and she felt the influence of an age eminently practical and sifting, but with small powers of acting the quiet Lady Bountiful duties that had sufficed her mother and sister were too small and easy to satisfy the soul burning at the report of the great cry going up to the heavens from a world of sin and woe. The examples of successful workers stimulated her longings to be up and about, to be up and doing, and yet the ever difficult question between charitable works and finality, difference, necessarily detained her, and perhaps all the more because it was not so much the fear of her mother's authority as the horror and despair that withheld her from the decisive and eccentric steps that she was always feeling impelled to take. Gentle Mrs. Curtis had never been a visible power in her house, and it was through this desire to avoid paining her that her governess had been exercised over her two daughters ever since her father's death, which had taken place in Grace's 7th year. Both she and Grace implicitly accepted Rachel's superiority as an unquestionable fact, and the mother, when traversing any of the clever daughter's schemes, never disputed either her opinions or principles, only entreated that these particular developments might be conceded to her own weakness, and Rachel generally did concede. She could not act, but she could talk uncontradicted, and she hated herself for the enforced submission to a state of things that she despised. This 25th birthday had long been anticipated as the turning point when this submissive girlhood ought to close, and the privileges of acting as well as thinking herself ought to be assumed. Something to do was her cry. And on this very day that something seemed to be cast in her way, it was not immoralitating the condition of the masses, and it was the educating those who might immoralitate and them. And Rachel gladly hailed the prospect of a vocation that might be conducted without pain to her mother. Young children of her own class were not exactly what her dream of usefulness had devised, but she had already a decided theory of education and began to read up with all her might, whilst taking the lead in all the details of the house-taking, servant hiring, etc., to which her regular occupations of night school in the evenings and reading to the lace makers by day became more secondary. In due time, the arrival of a ship was telegrammed at the hurried affection note followed, and on a bright east windy afternoon, Rachel Curtis set forth to take up her mission. A telegram had announced the arrival of the Volta and the train which would bring the travelers to Avonchester. The homestead carriage was sent to meet them and Rachel in it, to give her helpless cousin assistance in the beginning of the English habits. A roomy fly had been engaged for the nurses and children, and Mrs. Curtis had put under the coachman's charge a parcel of sandwiches and instructed him to offer all the appliances for making her own into an invalid carriage. Full of warm tenderness to those who were to be dependent on her exertions, led by her good sense, Rachel paced the platform till the engine rushed up and looked along the line of windows, suddenly bewildered. Doors opened, and the gentleman alone met her disappointed eye, until close to her a soft voice said, "Rachel," and she saw a figure in deep black close to her, but her hands had been hardly clasped before the face had turned eagerly to the tall, bearded man who was lifting out little boy after little boy, apparently in an endless stream, till at last a sleeping baby was brought out in the arms of a nurse. "Goodbye, thank you, oh, thank you. You will come soon. Oh, do come now." "Do come now," was the echoing by many voices. "I'll leave you in good hands. Goodbye. Goodbye, Conrad, dear. See that Cyril is doing... Never mind. Wilfred, the major, will come and see us. Run on with Cobe." This last was a respectful, military-looking servant who picked up a small child in one hand and a dressing case in the other and awaited orders. There was a clinging to the major by all the children, only ended by his final participating himself into the carriage and being borne off. Then came choruses of, "Mama, let me go with him." "I'll go with Mama." "Me going with Mama," according to the gradation of age. When Com and Mama decided the question by lifting the lesser ones into the fly, Rachel counted heads. Her mission exceeded her expectations. Here was a pair of boys in knickerbockers, a pair in petticoats, a pair in pestles, besides the thing in arms. When the fly had been nearly crammed, and 2 knickerbockers and 1 pelisse remained for the carriage, quite against Rachel's opinion. "But little Wilfred can sit on my lap. He has not been well, poor little man." With quiet conclusion, and when Rachel suggested lying back to rest, there was a sweet, low laugh and "Oh, no, thank you. Wilfred never tires me." Rachel's first satisfaction was in seeing the veil disclose the face of 8 years back, the same soft, clear olive skin, delicate, oval face, and pretty, deep brown eyes. With the same imploring, earnest sweetness, no signs of grown older, no signs of wear and tear, climate, or exertion, only the widow's dress and the presence of the great boys enhancing her soft youthfulness. The smile was certainly changed. It was graver, sadder, tenderer, and only conjured up by maternal affections, or in grateful reply and blitheness of the young brow had changed to quiet pensiveness. And more than ever there was an air of dependence, almost beseeching protection, and Rachel's heart throbbed with Britomart's devotion to her Henriette. "Why wouldn't the major come, Mamma?" "He will come soon, I hope, my dear." Those few words gave Rachel a strong antipathy to the major. Then began the conversation under difficulties, Fanny trying to inquire about her aunt, and Rachel to detail the arrangements made for her at Myrtle Wood. While the 2 boys were each accommodated with a window, but each moment they were claiming their mother's attention or rushing across the ladies' feet to each other's windows and treating Rachel's knees as a pivot and vouchsafing not the slightest heed to her attempts at intelligent pointing out of new schemes. And Fanny made no apology, but seemed pleased, ready with answers and with eyes, apparently ignorant of Rachel's toes, or was less insensible than her own. And her heavy 3-year-old Wilfred asleep in her lap all the time. She feeble, helpless, sickly, thought Rachel. I should have been less tired had I walked 20 miles. She gave up talking in despair, and by the time the young gentlemen had tired themselves into quietus and began to eat provisions, both ladies were glad to be allowed in silence. Coming over the last hill, Comrade roused as his mother summons to look up at home. And every word between them showed how fondly Avermouth had been remembered from far away. "The sea," said Fanny, leaning towards the catch, sight of the long gray line. "It is hard to believe we have been on it so long. This seems so much more my own." "Yes," cried Rachel, "you are come to your own home for us to take care of you." "I take care of Mama. Major Keith says so," indignantly claimed Comrade. "There's plenty of care for both of you to take," said Fanny, half smiling, half sobbing. "The Major says I need not be a poor creature, and I will try. But I am afraid I shall be on all your hands." Both boys drummed on her knees in a wrath at her presuming to call herself poor creature, Conrad glaring at Rachel as if to accuse her of calamity. "See the church?" said Lady Temple, glad to divert the storm and eagerly looking at the slender spire surmounting the bell turret of the building in an early decorated style, new but somewhat stained by the sea, without having as yet acquired the tender tints of time. "How beautiful," was her cry. "You were behind the collection for it when I went away. How we used to wish for it." "Yes, we did," said Rachel, with a significant sigh. But her cousins had no time to attend, for they were trying in a pepper box lodge. The boys were told that they were arrived, and they were at the door of a sort of overgrown Swiss cottage, where Mrs. Curtis and Grace stood ready to receive them. There was a confusion of embraces, fondling, and tears as Fanny clung to the aunt who had been a mother to her, perhaps a more tender one than the ruling, managing spirit, whom she had hardly known into her childhood. And it was only for a moment, for Wilfred shrieked out in an access of shyness at Grace's attempt to make acquaintance with him. Frances was demanding, "Where's the orderly?" and Conrad looking brimful of wrath at anyone who made his mother cry. Moreover, the fly had arrived, and the remainder had to be produced, named, and kissed. Conrad and Frances, Leon and Hubert, Wilfred and Cyril, and little Stephana, the baby. Really, the names were a study in themselves, and the cousins felt as if it would be a hopeless endeavor to apply them. Servants had been engaged conditionally, and the house was fully ready that the young mother could hardly listen to her aunt's explanation in her anxiety that the little ones should be rested and fed, and she responded with semi-comprehending thanks while moving on with the youngest in her arms, and as many hangings to her dress as could get hold of it. Her thanks grew more emphatic at the sight of the cribs and inviting order, and all things ready for a meal. "I don't drink tea with nurse," said Conrad, was Conrad's cry, and the signal of another general outcry, untranquilized by soothings and persuasion, till the door was shut on the younger half of the family, and those who could not open it remained to be comforted by the nurse, a soldier's widow who had been with the family since the birth of Conrad. The Temple form of shyness seemed to be consistent in ignoring strangers, but being neither abashed nor silent, only resenting or avoiding all attempts at intercourse. And as the boys rushed in and out of the rooms, exploring and exclaiming and calling Mamma, to the interruption of all that was going on, only checked for a few minutes by her uplifted hand and gentle hush, Grace saw her mother so stunned and bewildered that she rejoiced in the fear of cold that had decided that Rachel alone could spend the evening there. Fanny made some excuses. She longed to see more of her aunt, and when they were a little more settled, and as a fresh shout broke out, she was afraid they would rather unruly. She must come and talk to her at the dear homestead. So kind of Rachel to stay. Not that the boys seemed to think so, as they were racing in and out, stretching their ship-bound legs, and taking possession of the minute shrubbery, which they scorned from the want of gum trees and parrots. You won't mind, Rachel, dear. I must first see about baby. And Rachel was left to reflect on her mission while the boys' feet cantered up and down the house, and one or the other of them, would look in and burst away in search of the mamma. Little more satisfaction was the rest of the evening, for the boys took a great deal of waiting on at tea, and then some of the party would not go to sleep in strange bed without long persuasions and comfortings, till Fanny looked so weary that it was plain that no conversation could have been hoped from her, even if the baby had been less vivacious. All that could be done for her was to wish her good night and promise to come down early. Come early? Yes, Rachel might come, but what was the use of that when Fanny was at mercy of so many calamities? She looked much better than the day before, and her sweet, soft welcome was most cordial and clinging. Dear Rachel, it is like a dream to have you so near. I feel like the old life come back again, to hear the surge of the sea all night, and know I should see you again, you all, so soon. Yes, it is a great satisfaction to have you back in the house, under our wing. I have a great deal to tell you about the arrangements. Oh, yes, thank you, Mama, roared 3 to 2 voices. I wanted to explain to you, but Fanny's eye was roaming around just then in the burst of the 2 boys. Mama, Nurse won't undo the tin box, and my ship is in it, and the Major gave it to me. Yes, and my stuffed duckbill, and I want it, Mama. My dear Con, the Major would not let you shout so loud about it, and you have not spoken to Aunt Rachel. The boys did present their hands, and then returned to charge. Please order Nurse to unpack it, Mama, and then Kobe will help us with the sail. Excuse me, dear Rachel, said Fanny. I will first see to this. And a very long seeing it was, probably meaning that she unpacked the box herself, whilst Rachel was deciding on the terrible spoiling of the children and preparing a remonstrance. Dear Rachel, you have been left a long time. Oh, never mind that. But Fanny, you must not give way to those children so much. They will be always. Hark! Was that the doorbell? It was, and the visitor was announced as Mr. Touchet, a small, dark, thin young clergyman he was, of a nervous manner, which, growing more nervous as he took hands with Rachel, became abrupt and hesitant. My call is early, Miss Temple, and I always pay my respects at once to any new resident, in case I be of any service. Thank you, I am very obliged, said Fanny, with a sweet, gracious smile, and manner that would have made him much more at ease at once, if Rachel had not added, my cousin is quite at home here, Mr. Touchet. Oh, yes, he said. So I understand. I know no place in England so well. It is quite a home to me. So beautiful it is, continued Fanny. And you see great changes here? Changes so much for the better, said Fanny, smiling her winning smile again. One only expects more from improvements than they effect, put on Rachel severely. One only expects more from improvements than they effect, said Rachel severely. You have a large young party, said Mr. Touchet, looking uneasily towards Lady Temple. Yes, I have 6 boys and 1 little girl. 7, said Mr. Touchet. Looked up half incredulous at the girl contour of the gentle face and cast down his eyes as if afraid he had been rude. 7! It is a great charge. Yes, indeed it is, she said earnestly, and I am sure you will be kind enough to give my influence to help me with them, poor boys. Oh, he exclaimed. Anything I can do, in such a transport of eager helpfulness that Rachel coldly said, We are all anxious to assist in the care of the children. He colored up, and with a sort of effort at self-assertion, blurted out, as the clergyman of the parish, and there halted, and he began looking foolish when Lady Temple took him up in her soft, persuasive way. Of course we shall look to you so much, and you will be so kind as to let me know if there is anyone I can send any broth to at any time. Thank you, you're very good. And he was quite himself again. I shall have the pleasure of sending you down a few names. I never did approve of broken victual system, began Rachel. It creates dependence. Come here, Hubert, said Franny, beckoning a boy she saw at a distance. Come and shake hands with Mr. Touchet. It was the instinct rather than reason. There was a fencing between Rachel and the croquet that made her uncomfortable and led her to break it off by any means in her power. And though Mr. Touchet was not much at his ease with the little boy, the discussion was staged off. But again, Mr. Touchet made bold to say that in case Mrs. Temple wished for a daily governess, he knew a very desirable young person, a most admirable pair of sisters who had met with great reverses. But Rachel snapped him off shorter than ever. We can decide nothing yet. I have made up my mind to teach the little boys at present. Oh, indeed. It is very kind, said the perplexed Lady Temple. I beg your pardon. I only thought, in case you were wishing for someone, that Mrs. Williams will be at liberty shortly. I do not imagine Mrs. Williams is the person to deal with the little boys. In fact, I think that home teaching is always better than hired. I am so much obliged, said Fanny, as Mr. Touchet, after this defeat, rose up to take leave, and she held out her hand, smiled and thanked, and sent him on his way. Sent him away, so much sweetened and gratified that Rachel would have instantly begun to dissect him. But that was a whole rush of boys broken in, and again they engrossed their mother, and in the next lull the uppermost necessity was of explaining about the servants who had been hired for the time, one of whom was a young woman whose wealth had given way over her lace pillow, and Rachel was eloquent over the crying evils of the system. Everything was a system with Rachel, and chained girls to the unhealthy occupation in the early childhood, and made an overstocked market and underpaid workers, holding Fanny fast to listen by a sort of fascination in her overpowering earnestness and great fixed eyes, which when once their grasp was taken and would not release the victim. And this was a matter of daily occurrence on which Rachel felt keenly and spoke strongly. It is very sad. If you want to help the poor things, I will give anything I can. Oh, yes, Thank you. But it is dolefully merely to help them to linger out the remnant of life and consumed upon these cobwebs of vanity. It is the foundation head that must be reached, and the root of the system. Fanny saw, or rather felt, a boy making signs at the window, but durst not withdraw her eyes from the fascination of those eager ones. Lace and lace markers are facts, continued Rachel, but if the middlemen are exploded, and the excess of the workers drafted off by some wholesome outlet, the price would rise, so that the remainder would be a leisure to fulfill the domestic offices of womanhood. There was a great uproar above. I beg your pardon, dear Rachel, and away went Fanny. I do declare, cried Rachel, when Grace, having detached her home cares, entered the room a quarter of an hour after. Poor Fanny, a perfect slave. One can't get a word in edgewise. Fanny at last returned, and with her baby, and there was no chance for even Rachel to assert herself into while the small queen was present. Grace was devoted to infants, and there was a whole court of brothers vying with one another in picking up her constantly dropped toys and performing antics for her amusement. Rachel, desirous to be gracious and resigned, attempted conversation with one of the eldest pair, but the baby had but to look towards him, and he was at her feet. On her departure, Rachel resumed the needful details of the arrangement respecting the house and servants, and found Lady Temple as grateful and submissive as ever, except that, when advised to take Myrtlewood for a term of 7 years, she replied that the Major had advised her not to bind herself down at once. Did you let him think we should quarrel? Oh, no, my dear. But it might not agree with the children. Avonmouth, Grace, do you hear the hearsay Fanny has been learning? Why, the proportion of the ozone in the air here has been calculated to be 500 times that of Eventon. Yes, dearest, said poor Fanny, very humbly and very scared. There is no place like Avonmouth. And I am sure that the Major will think so when he has seen it. But what has he to do with your movements? Sir Stephen wished, murmured Fanny. The Major is military secretary and always settles on headquarters, and no one interferes with him, shouted Conrad. Rachel, suspicious and jealous of her rival, was obliged to let Fanny pass on the next item, where her eager acceptance of all that was prescribed to her was evidently meant to be compensation for her refractioniness about the house. Grace had meanwhile applied herself to keeping off the boys and of making some progress in the good graces and in distinguishing between their shallow faces and dark eyes and crisp black heads. Conrad was individualized, not only by a superior height, but by soldiering bearing, bright pride glancing in his eyes, his quick gesture, bold, decided words, and imperious tone towards all save his mother, and whatever he was doing, his keen black eye was always turning in search of her. He was ever ready to spring to her side to wait on her, to maintain her cause in rough companionship, or to claim her attention to himself. Francis was a thick-set and round-shouldered, bullet-headed and dull-eyed in comparison, not aggressive, but holding his own, and not very approachable. Leolin, thin, white-cheeked, large-eyed, and fret-filled lip, was ready to whine at Conrad's tyranny and Francis's appropriations, but was grateful for Grace's protection, and more easy of access than his elders, and Hubert was a handsome, placid child, the good boy, as well as the beauty of the family. The pair in the nursery hardly came on the stage, and the two elders would be quite sufficient for Mrs. Curtis, with whom the afternoon was to be spent. The mother evidently considered it a very long absence, but she was anxious to see both her aunt and her own home, and set out leaning on Rachel's arm, and smiling, pleased though sad recognition of the esplanade and the pebbly beach, bathing machines and fishing boats, and pointing them out to her sons, whom, on their side, could only talk of the much greater excellence of Melbourne. Within the gates of the homestead, there was a steep, sharp bit of road, cut out in the red sandstone rock, and after a few paces she paused to rest, with a sigh that brought Conrad to her side, when she put her arms around his neck and leant on his shoulders, and even her two supporters could not prevent her from looking pale and exhausted. "Never mind," she said. "This salt wind is delightful. How like old times it is." And she stood gazing across the little steep lawn at the gray sea, the line of houses following the curve of the bay and straggling up the valley in the rear, and the purple headlands projecting point beyond point, showing them to her boys and telling their names. "It is all ugly and cold," said Francis, with an ungraceful shiver. "I shall go home to Melbourne when I am a man." "And you will come, Mamma?" added Conrad. He had no answer, for Fanny was in her aunt's arms, and like mother and daughter, they clung to each other, more able to sympathize, more truly one together, than the young widow could be with either of the girls. As soon as Fanny had rested and enjoyed the home atmosphere downstairs, she began to visit the dear old rooms, and carried Conrad through a course of recognitions through the scarcely altered apartments. Only one had been changed, and namely the schoolroom. Which had been stripped of the kind of old shabby furniture that Fanny tenderly recollected, and was decidedly bare, but a mahogany box stood on a stand on one side, and there was a great accession of books and writing implements occupied the plain deal table in the center. "What have you done with the dear old room? Do you not use it still?" asked Fanny. "Yes, I work here," said Rachel. Vainly did Lady Temple look for that which women call work. "I have hitherto ground on after education and self-improvement," said Rachel. "Now I trust to make a preparation available for others. I will undertake any of your boys if you wish." "Thank you. But what is that box?" In obedience to a curious push and pull from Conrad. "It is her dispensary," said Grace. "Yes," said Rachel. "You are weak and nervous, and I have just the thing for you." "Is it homeopathy?" "Yes, here is my book. I have done great things in my district, and should do more, but for prejudice. There, the globe is the very thing for you. I made it out last night in my book." "That is right, and I wanted to ask you some questions about little Wilfred." Fanny had obediently swallowed the globe, her own globe, and little Wilfred was a different matter. She retreated with the large eyes and open book, saying that he was better, and that Mr. Fenton should look at him. But Rachel was not alluded, and was at the full career of elocution to that meanest capacity, when a sharp skirmish between the boys ended the conversation, and it appeared that Conrad had caught Francis just commencing an onslaught of globes, and taking them for English sweetness of a minute description. The afternoon passed with a strange heaviness well known to those who find it hard to resume broken threads after long partings. There was much affection and not full certainty what to talk about, and the presence of the boys would have hindered confidence, and even had they not incessantly occupied their mother. Conrad indeed betook himself to a book, but Francis was the only kept out of mischief by constant turning over pictures with him. However, at dark, Combe came to convey them home, and the ladies of the homestead experienced a sense of relief. Rachel immediately began to talk of an excellent preparatory school. I was thinking of asking you if there is any one here who could come in for daily governess. Oh, cried Rachel, these two would be much better off at school, and I would form the little ones who are still manageable. Conrad is not 8 years old yet, said his mother with an imploring tone, and the major said I need not part with him till he is grown a little more used to the English ways. He can read, I see, said Grace, and he told me he had done some Latin with the major. Yes, he had picked up a vast deal of information, and on the voyage the major used to teach him out of a little pocket Virgil. The major said it would not be of much use at school, as there was no dictionary, and that the discipline and occupation was useful, and so they were. Conrad will do anything for the major, and indeed so will they all. 3 majors in one speech, thought Rachel, and by the way of the contradiction she enunciated, I could undertake the pair of boys easily, and these two are evidently wanting school discipline. Lady Temple feathered up, like a mother dove, over her nest. You do not know Conrad. He is trustworthy and affectionate, dear boy, and they are both always good with me. The major said it often hurts boys to send them too young. They are very young, poor little fellows, said Miss Curtis. And if they are forward in something that are backward in others, said Fanny. What Major Keith recommended was a governess, and who would know what is generally expected of little boys. I don't like half measures, muttered Rachel. I do not approve of encouraging young women to crowd the overstocked possessions of governesses. Fanny opened her brown eyes and awaited the words of wisdom. Is it not fragrant abuse, continued Rachel, that whether she had a vocation or not, every woman of a certain rank who wishes to gain her own livelihood must need to become a governess? A nursery maid must have a vocation, but an educated or half-educated woman has no choice, and the educator she must become to her own detriment, and that of her victims. I always did think governesses often much to be pitied, said Frances, finding something was expected of her. What's the use of pity if one runs on its old groove? We must prevent the market from being drugged by diverting the supply into new lines. Are there any new lines? Asked Fanny, surprised in the progress of society in her absence. Homeopathic doctoress, whispered Grace, who, dutifully as she was, sometimes indulged in a little fun, which Rachel was affably received unless she took it in earnest, as the present instance. May not, I ask, why not? Some women have broken through prejudice, and why should not others? Do you not agree with me, Fanny, that female medical men, and I mean medical women, would be an infinite boon? It would be very nice if they would never be nervous. Nerves are merely a matter of training. Think of the number that might be removed from the responsibility of incompletely educating. I declare that to tempt a person into the office of governess instead of opening her a new field to her is the most short-sighted indolence. I don't want to tempt anyone, said Fanny. She ought to have been out before and been experienced, only she must be the kind to the poor boys. I wanted the major to inquire in London, but he said perhaps I might hear of someone here. That was right, my dear, returned her aunt. A gentleman, an officer, could not do much in such a matter. He always does manage whatever one wants. At which speech Rachel cast a glance toward her mother and saw her looking questioning and perplexed. I was thinking, said Rachel, that I believe the people at the Cliff Cottage are going away, and that Miss Williamson might be at liberty. I didn't know that Grace would come out with Miss Williams, exclaimed Rachel, an irregular eruption of the touche mania, and have had him already advertising to her. Mrs. Williams, said Mrs. Curtis. Yes, she might suit you very well. I believe that there are very respectable young women, poor things. I have always wished that we could do more for them. Who? Said Fanny. Certain pets of Mr. Touché's, said Rachel. Some of the numerous ladies whose mission is the clairvoyance into which Grace would lapse, but for the strenuousness of my efforts. I don't quite know why you call them his pets, said Grace, except that he knew their assessment and told us about them. Exactly. That was enough for me. I preferably understand that meaning of Mr. Touché's recommendation, and if what Fancy wants is a commonplace sort of upper nursemaid, I dare say it would do. And Rachel leant back, applied herself to her wood carving, and virtually retired from the discussion. One sister is a great invalid, said Grace, quite a cripple, and the other goes out as a daily governess. They are a clergyman's daughters, and once were very well off, but lost everything through some speculation of their brother. I believe he fled the country under some terrible suspicion of dishonesty, and though no one thought they had anything to do with it, their friends dropped them, because they would not give him up, nor believe him guilty. And a little girl of his lives with them. Poor things, exclaimed Lady Temple. I should not much like to employ this one. How very sad. Mrs. Gray told me that her children had never done it so well with anyone, said Mrs. Curtis. She wanted to engage Mrs. Williams permanently, but could not induce her to leave her sister, or even to remove her to London on account of her health. Do you know her, Grace? Asked Fanny. I have called once or twice, and have been very much pleased with the sick sister, but Rachel does not fancy that said. You see, I met the other at the Sunday school. I like her looks and manner very much, and she is always at the early service before work. Just like a mauve book, muttered Rachel. Fanny absolutely stared. You go, don't you, Rachel? How we used to wish for it. You have wished, and we have tried, said Rachel with a sigh. Yes, Rachel, said Grace, but with all the backdraws, all disappointments in ourselves, it is a great blessing. We would not be without it. I could not be satisfied in relinquishing it voluntarily, said Rachel, but I am necessarily the one of the idle. Where I one of the occupied laborious as a corps would satisfy me, and that poor governess ought to feel the same. Think of the physical reaction of body on mind, and tell me if you could have the barbarity of depriving that poor jaded thing of an hour's sleep, giving her an additional walk, fasting in all weathers, and preparing her to be the savage with these children. Perhaps it refreshes her and hinders her from being cross. Maybe she thinks so, but if she had ever the sense or ear, nothing would be predispose her to be cross, as the squeaking of Mr. Touchet's penny whistle choir. Poor Mr. Touchet, sighed Mrs. Curtis. I wish he would not make such an ambitious attempt. But you like the choral service, said Fanny, feeling as if everything had turned around. When all the men of retirement chant together, you cannot think how grand it is, almost finer than a cathedral. Yes, where you can do it, said Rachel, but not where you can't. I wish you would talk about it, said Grace. I must, or Fanny will not understand the state of parties of Avermouth. Parties? Oh, I hope not. My dear child, party spirit is another word for vitality. So you thought the church we sighed for had made the place all we sighed to see it, and ourselves too. Oh, Fanny, is this what you have been across the world for? What is wrong? Asked Fanny, alarmed. Do you remember the oxman? Build your church, and the rest will take care of itself. You remember our scraping and begging, and how that good Mr. Davidson helped us out and bought the endowment up to the needful point of consecration, on the condition of the inquiry was given to him. He held it just a year, and was rich, and could help out. His bad health was accurate. But first he had met Madeira, and then he died, and there we are, a perpetual currency of 70 pounds a year, no resident gentry but ourselves, a fluctuating population, mostly sick, our poor demoralized by them, and either crazed by dissent or heathenized by the former distance from church. Who would take us? No more Mr. Davidson. There was no more novelty, and too much smartness to invite self-devotion. So we were driven from pillar to post till we settled down into this Touchet. As good a being as ever lived, working as hard as two, and sparing neither himself nor anyone else. Fanny looked up, prepared to admire. But he has two misfortunes. He was not born a gentleman, and his mind does not measure an inch across. Rachel, my dear, it is not fair to prejudice Fanny, and I am sure that the poor man is very well behaved. Mother, would you be calling the ideal Anglican priest poor man? I thought he was quite gentlemanlike, added Fanny. Gentlemanlike. Ah. That's it, said Rachel. And just so like as to delight the born of cultures like Grace and Mrs. Williams. Would it hurt the children? Asked Fanny, hardly comprehending the tumultuous term. Yes, it affected you, said Rachel, intending some playfulness. A mother of contracted mind, of forfeits the allegiance of her sons. Oh, Rachel, I know I am weak and silly, said the gentle young widow, terrified. But the major said if I only tried to do my duty by them, I should be helped. And I will help you, Fanny, said Rachel. All that is required is good sense and firmness, and a thorough sense of responsibility. That is what is so dreadful, the responsibility of all those dear fatherless boys. And if I should do wrong by them. Poor Fanny fell into an uncontrollable fit of weep at the sense of her own desolation and helplessness, and Mrs. Curtis came to comfort her and tell her affectionately of having gone through the like feelings, and have repeated the most comfortable words of promise to the fatherless and the widow, words that had constantly come before the sufferer, but which had by no means lost their virtue by repetition, and Fanny was soothed with the hearing instances of the special providence over orphaned sons, and their love and deference for their mother. Rachel, shocked and distressed at the effect of her sense, retired out of the conversation till at the announcement of the carriage of the Lady Temple. Her gentle cousin cheered up, and feeling herself to blame for having grieved one who only meant aid and kindness, came to her and fondly kissed her forehead, saying, "I am not vexed, dear Rachel. I know you are right. I am not clever enough to bring them up properly, and if I try hard and pray for them, it may be made up to them. And as long as you help me, Rachel dear," she added, as her readiness woe, offering her tears, and it was the most effectual, for Rachel was perfectly contented as long as Fanny was dependent on her, and allowed her to assume her mission, provided only the counter-influence could be averted. And this Major, this universal referee, he eradicated from her foolishness climbing habits of resilience before her spirits were enough recovered to lay her heart open to danger. But the more Rachel saw of her cousin, the more she realized this peril. When she went down on Monday morning to complete the manners of business that they had slurred on the Saturday, she found that Fanny was not in the slightest notion that her own income was to be. All she knew was that the General had left everything unreserved to her except £100 and one of his swords to Major Keith, who was executioner to this will, and had gone to London to see about it, by which poor word Fanny expressed all the business that her maintenance depended on. If a old general wish made her mistake the terms of bequest, and the Sir Stephen must have secured his property to his children. But Fanny was absolutely certain that this was not the case, for she said that Major had made her at once sign a will dividing the property among them, and appointing himself and her Aunt Curtis their guardians. I did not like putting such a charge on my dear aunt, said Fanny, but the Major said I ought to appoint a relation, and I had no one else, and I knew you would all be good to them if they had lost me too, when the baby was born. We would have tried, said Rachel humbly, but oh, I am glad you were here, Fanny. Nothing could, of course, be fixed till the Major had seen about it, after which he was to come to let Lady Temple know the result. But she believed he would first go to Scotland to see his brother. He and his brother were the only survivors of a large family, and he had been on foreign service for 12 years. So that it would be a very selfish to wish him not to take full time at home. Selfish, thought Rachel. If he will only stay away long enough, we shall learn, my dear, how well you can do without him. The boys had interrupted the conversation less than the previous one, because the lesser ones were asleep or walking out, and the elder ones, having learnt that a new week had begun steadily with lessons, thought it advisable to bring themselves a little into notice as possible. But fate was sure to pursue them sooner or later, for Rachel had come down, resolved on testing their acquirement, and deciding on the method to be pursued with them, and thought their mamma, with a curtain instinctive shrink, both of them and her for herself, had put off the ordeal to the utmost by listening to all of the counsel about her affairs. It was not to be adverted. Now, Fanny, since it seems that more cannot be done at present, let me see about the children's education. Where are their books? We have very few books, said Fanny, hesitating. We had not much choice where we were. You should have written to me for a selection. Why? So we would. But there was always a talk of sending Conrad and Frances home, and I am afraid you will think them backwards, dear Rachel, especially Francie. But it is not their fault, dear children, and they were not used to strangers, added Fanny nervously. I do not mean to be a stranger, said Rachel, and while Franny in confusion made lovingly protestations about not meaning that, Rachel stepped out onto the lawn and in a clear voice called Conrad, Frances. No answer. She called Conrad again and louder and turned around with a, where can they be? Not gone down onto the beach. Oh, dear no, I trust not. And there, said their mother, flurried, and coming to the window with a call that seemed to Rachel's ears like a roar of a suckling dove. But from behind the bushes forth came the two young gentlemen, their black garment considerably streaked with green marks of laurel climbing. Oh, my dears, what figures you are! Go to comb and get yourself brushed and wash your hands and come down and bring your lesson books. Rachel prognosticated that these preparations would not be made the occasion or much waste of time, but she was answered with rather surprised eyes that they had never been allowed to come into the drawing-room without looking like little gentlemen. But you are not living in the same state here, said Rachel. I never could enter the some family, Mamma especially paying to their drawing-room. The Major used to be very particular about their not coming to sit down untidy, said Franny. He said it was not good for anybody. Very neat, thought Rachel, nearly ready to advocate the boys for making no toilet of time, and the present was made to consume so much that time, urged by her, Fanny once more was obliged to summon her boys and their books. It was not an extensive school library. A Latin grammar was an extremely dilapidated spelling book and a fourth volume of Mrs. Merchant's Little Willie. And other three, one was accompanied for, but Cyril had torn up the second, and Frances had thrown the first overboard in a passion. Rachel looked in dismay. I don't know what can be done with these, she said. Oh, then, we'll have a holiday till they've got books, Mamma, said Conrad, putting his hands on the sofa and imitating a kicking horse. It is very necessary to see what kind of books you ought to have, returned Rachel. How far have you gone in this? I say, Mamma, reiterated Conrad, we can't do lessons without books. Attend to what your Aunt Rachel says, my dear. She wants to find out what books you should have. Yes, let me examine you. Conrad came most inconveniently close to her, and she pushed her chair back. He came after her. His mother, uttered a remonstrating, my dear. I thought she wanted to examine me, quoth Conrad. When Mr. Vicard examines a thing, he puts it under a microscope. It was said gravely, and whether it was malice or simplicity, Rachel was simply unable to divine. But she thought away that Fanny had no business to laugh, and explaining the species of examination that she intended, she went to work. In her younger days, she would have worked much at schools. and was ready to an able and spirited teacher. Liking the occupation and laying hold of the first book in her way, she requested Conrad to read. He obeyed, but in such a detestable gabble that she looked up, unappealing, to Franny, who suggested, "My dear, you can read better than that." He read 4 lines, not badly, and then broke off. "Mamma, are not we to have ponies? Cobb heard of a pony this morning. It is to be seen in the Jolly Mariner, and he will take us to look at it." The Jolly Mariner? It is a dreadful place. Fanny, you never will let them go there. "My dear, the Major will see about your ponies when he comes. He will send the coachman down to inquire," said Rachel. He is only a civilian, and the Major always chose our horses," said Conrad. "And I am the one too, Mamma. And I want one too, Mamma," added Frances. "You know I have been out 4 times with the staff, and the Major said I could ride as well as Con. Reading is what is wanted now, my dears. Go on." 5 lines more. But Francis and his mother were whispering together, and of course Conrad stopped to listen, and Rachel saw that there was no hope but in getting him alone, and at his mother's reluctant desire, he followed her to the dining room, and there he turned, dogged and indifferent, made a sort of fret of doing what he was told, and whether she tried him in arithmetic, Latin, or diction, he made such ludicrous blunders as to leave her in perplexity whether they rose from ignorance or impertinence. His spelling was phonetic to the highest degree, and though he owned to having done sums, he did not answer the simplest question in mental arithmetic. 5 apples and 8 ansels. Come, comrade, what will they make? A pie. That was the hopeful way in which the examination proceeded, and when Rachel attempted to say that his mother would be much displeased, he proceeded to tumble head over heels all around the room as if he knew better, which performance broke up the seance, and resolved on her part that when she had the books she would not be so beaten. She tried Francis, but he really did not. He did know next to nothing, and whether he came to a word above 5 letters long, stopped short, and when told to spell it, said, "Mamma made him spell," all muttering something dispiritingly about civilians. Rachel was a woman of perseverance. She went to the booksellers and obtained a fair amount of books, which she ordered to be sent to the Lady Temples. But when she came down the next morning, the parcel was nowhere to be found. There was a grand interrogation, and at last it turned out to be safely deposited in an empty dog kennel in the backyard. It was very hard on Rachel that Fanny giggled like a schoolgirl, and even though ashamed of herself and her sons, could not find a voice to scold them respectfully. No wonder, after such encouragement, that Rachel found her submission no sincere, and felt at the end of the morning's work much as she had driving pigs into a market, though the repetition was imposing on the boys a sort of sense of fate and obedience. There was less active resistance, though learning was not, only letting teaching be thrown at them. At the rest of the day, except for those 2 hours, they ran wild around the house, garden, beach, the latter place under the inspection of Mr. Combe, whom, since the Jolly Mariner proposal, Rachel did not at the least trust. All the less when she heard of Major Keith, whose soldier servants he had originally been, thought very highly of him. A call at Myrtle Wood was formidable from the Bear Garden sounds, and the delicate as Miss Lady Temple was considered to be, unable to walk or bear fatigue, she never appeared to be incommoded by the uproar in which she lived, and even been seen careering about the nursery or running around the garden in a way that Grace and Rachel thought would tire a strong woman. As the tete-a-tete with her, it was never secure by any short of Rachel's strong will, for the children were always with her, and when she went to bed, or at any rate in her room, when they did, and she was so perfectly able to play and laugh with them that her cousins scarcely thought she sufficiently depressed, and comparing her with that of their own mother, had been 10 months after a 10 months widowhood, agreed that after all she had been very young and Sir Stephen very old, and perhaps too much must not have been expected of her. The grand passion of her life is yet to come, said Rachel. I hope not, said Grace. You may be certain of that, said Rachel. Feminine women always have it one time or another in their lives. Only superior ones are exempt. But I hope I may have influence enough to carry her past it and prevent her from taking any step that might be injurious to the children. End of chapter 1.